Welcome to the 2021 SNU News World Student Forum, facing the new wave direction of Northeast Asia trade in the era of Biden. My name is So-Hyun Lee, and I'll be your host for today. What lies in the future for international trade? As Joe Biden has been inaugurated as the 46th President of the United States, it is expected that a new wave will be spread to Asia as well. And over the next 2 hours, with discussions between the panels from Korea, the United States, and Japan, we hope to find answers to the question.
It's a great pleasure with you today. The point I want to talk about is the question, will the Biden administration continue the hard line of economic and trade policies toward China, which have had a very disruptive impact on Northeast Asian countries like South Korea and Japan? Will this continue? And to help me to explain that to you, I want to look at the measures that are very important in determining American China policy in this regard. Over 3 years ago, the Trump administration began a harder policy toward China. And that policy, very strong economic dimension. China was emerged as a great power economically, and that it was coming to dominate the high-tech industry of the future. If China dominated economic industries, leading economic power, those are fundamental to American power. Moreover, if the Chinese dominated those economic areas, they would become the dominant military power, because the American military depends on this high technology industries. And so the view in the administration at the time, Mr. Trump's administration, but more importantly, bipartisan congressional support for this view is a very important driver. The States has a tough policy toward China. And so this dimension is, I think, very important for people in Korea, Japan, and elsewhere to understand. The sense of threat, the sense of being dominated by China because of these high technology industries being dominated by China. And so that, in combination with many other complaints that the United States has about China, all sorts of issues, has led to a situation that has been reinforced with a very negative feeling toward China on the part of American public opinion and American media, and so forth. And so this kind of atmosphere, you find the forces inside the United States arguing for a continuation of a hard policy toward China. Maybe not the same policy Mr. Trump had, but nonetheless a very hard policy, are very strong. And so that's the first point I wanted to make sure that people understood this. It's not that everybody in the United States thinks this. No, it's that important leaders and the majorities in both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party in the Congress feel this way. It's very important to understand that. Okay, now the second point then I want to look at is just to explain a little bit how Mr. Biden is so important in this situation. He is a foreign policy expert. He will make China policy. The ultimate decision will be his, and he will know a lot, and he has a lot of experience in making China policy. So these forces will influence, but he's the decider. And how does he decide? His mode of operation is pretty clear. He seeks the middle ground. He seeks the middle ground in dealing with various issues insofar as he can. And he needs support for these positions. One way he's looking for support is with allies and partners. We've had visits of senior leaders to South Korea and Japan recently. So the administration wants to have their support. And in the process, what Mr. Biden does is that he compromises. Once the allies and partners have views and he has views, and then he'll compromise to reach an agreement. He'll seek a middle ground. But at the same time, he's doing this kind of negotiations with the Congress. He needs the Congress to support him too. And so he's negotiating with them as well. And what results from this type of situation is that the domestic forces in the United States, and by that I mean bipartisan majorities in the Congress, the Republicans as a party are very critical of Mr. Biden on China policy. They're prepared to attack him if he does things that are seen as soft on China. And then you have public opinion and media opinion generally quite negative about China. On top of that, you have Chinese behavior. Chinese behavior is not compromising on any of these areas where they have differences with the United States. There's no compromise at all. So all of those factors on the domestic side in the United States mean that Mr. Biden, when he negotiates with them, he's going to come up with a great common ground that is hard toward China on trade issues, and will continue the pressures on Korea and Japan to line up with the United States on various high technology and other sensitive trade issues, which Korea and Japan don't want to do. But this is, I think, likely to happen. On the other hand, he's going to want to work with Japan and with South Korea, understanding their business interests. They will reflect they don't want this hard policy because of their business interests. They will want a softer policy. And he'll probably come to some arrangements with them. And there are some reasons in the Biden administration to have some constructive relationships with China on climate change and other issues. And so he will be more moderate on that score too. And so this is the state of play that you face today in trying to determine, will Mr. Biden continue these tough policies? I see the balance as favoring a continuation of the tough policies with certain modifications. But I think Japan and I think South Korea will face continued pressures from the United States to line up with the United States on key issues that are seen as very important, particularly in this high technology competition that the United States and China are in the high technology areas of the economy. So that's my presentation for today. I hope that's helpful. It gives you some insight into the domestic drivers of American policy, which I think people in Asia often don't understand very well. And this is one person's view on it, but I think it's a significant aspect that needs consideration in this type of a panel and this type of a conference. So thank you very much for the opportunity, but that's all I have to say.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here. So I was asked to talk about U.S.-China trade relations and its potential impacts on the Korean Peninsula. And I think the place I would start off with, and the obvious thing, is that right now, Sino-American relations are as bad as I've ever seen them since I started working on U.S.-Asian relations. And part of it is a legacy of the Trump administration. And part of it is that it has been exacerbated by the global pandemic. I think COVID-19 has made an already tense relationship between the United States and China even worse. And whether he likes it or not, this is the relationship that Biden is going to inherit from the Trump administration. And I think the United States has tended to blame China for COVID-19. I think to some degree, a lot of the blame that's put on China is not completely fair. I do believe that the Chinese government played a role in suppressing information about the virus initially. But when you look at how the United States is doing in containing the spread of COVID in comparison to a place like South Korea, I think it reflects very badly on the Trump administration. I think if we had better leadership, we could do what Moon Jae-in is doing. But I think that ultimately this poor image of China that exists now as a result of COVID-19 is going to make any kind of reconciliation between the United States and China very difficult, at least in the immediate future. So what do I expect to see? This is basically decoupling. I think decoupling is going to be a very prominent theme in American foreign policy and in American trade relations with China during the next 4 years. And by decoupling, I basically mean an effort to reduce America's dependency on China and lessen the scope of American investment in China. And I don't think decoupling is completely a bad thing or completely ill-intentioned. I think one of the things that the pandemic made clear is that excessive reliance on China for any kind of goods, it's just not in the United States' interest, and it's not completely in China's interest either. So I think some degree of decoupling is inevitable and even desirable. But at the same time, I think too much decoupling or too rapid decoupling is going to be impossible. You'll hear a lot of American officials talking about it and how they want to drastically reduce our reliance on China. But the reality is that we can't. We can't do it completely. Apple sells a lot of iPhones in China, right? I don't think that the United States wants that to stop anytime soon. Hollywood blockbusters have earned, millions of dollars in China. I don't think the United States wants that to stop anytime soon. So I do think that there will be decoupling, but there will also be a limit to how much decoupling you can realistically pursue. What do I expect to see from the Biden administration? I would say one thing that I definitely expect to see is that, ongoing criticisms of China's unfair trade practices. And again, I put it in quotation mark because what the United States considers unfair is, not considered perfectly legitimate by China. But at the same time, I think this is definitely going to be one of the points of emphasis. I also think you're going to see some more specific policies. The Biden administration is going to increasingly demand that China stop favoring state-owned companies and preventing competition. This is something that the Chinese government has done. I think you could say the Chinese government has been doing this for a long time, but it has become more and more of an issue as Chinese companies are going into some of the same more advanced sectors that American companies are going into. And I think you'll see that especially when it comes to the area of technology. And I think you're going to see new efforts on the part of the Biden administration and the United States to limit the activities of Chinese companies such as Huawei. You already saw that towards the end of the Trump administration. They were talking about demanding actions against Huawei. They were going to ban WeChat and other popular apps that American officials raise security concerns. I think, most people in the federal government may already be prohibited from using some of these apps. So you're going to see an increase in that. In some of these sectors, there will be peaceful competition, but in other cases, the competition will be more strident. What will China do? I think we can expect China to do a few things. First, it's going to put more and more calls on the United States to lift tariffs. This human rights is going to be a much bigger issue in Sino-American relations during the next few years. The Trump administration was somewhat hesitant when it came to criticizing China on Xinjiang. It criticized China on a whole range of other things, but when it came to Xinjiang or Tibet, the Trump administration was relatively tight-lipped. I think that will change. Biden has been more critical, and a lot of the people in his administration have been more critical of China on these kinds of human rights issues. Human rights is also much more of I wouldn't say it's much more of a Democrat issue than a Republican issue, but I do think if you look at the people that Biden's appointed, a number of them have emphasized this. And I think you saw this during this very tense dialogue between Chinese and American leaders that occurred in Alaska just a few days ago. And I think one of the ways that China will respond to this is through continuing efforts to expand its own influence. And the regions where China is, of course, most keen on seeking greater influence are Southeast Asia, Central Asia. These are regions where China has been actively trying to promote the Belt and Road Initiative or the New Silk Road. China has made vast investments in these regions. And, I think we can expect to continue to see that. What is South Korea's challenge? First of all, I think Bob was absolutely right. South Korea is going to come under considerable pressure from the United States to align with it when it comes to containing China or to countering Chinese influence. And it's going to be economic. We've already seen some strategic aspects of this, for instance, the THAAD, which became an issue a few years ago. And so you're going to see that. I think ideally, the United States would like to see South Korea and Japan improve their relationships, but I think it's going to be very tough because, especially with the new Japanese prime minister, I do hope that the Biden administration will put more pressure on Japan to acknowledge the horrible atrocities that it committed during World War II. But there's always been a limit to how hard it will be pushed. And finally, I think, there's going to be questions and confusions over what South Korea's role should be in the Quad or other regional security infrastructures. And this is a complex question. I don't think South Korea necessarily needs to be in the Quad to be part of a broader coalition of democracies in Asia. But nonetheless, I think figuring out South Korea's role is going to be very tricky. And of course, part of the reason is because it faces pressure from both sides. Economically, its relationship with China is very important, but strategically and economically as well, its relationship with the United States is also very important. And I think the South Korean government is going to continue to ask not to be put in a position where it has to choose between these two sides, but there's going to be more and more pressure for it to do so. I would just say one last word in closing, that while I think there's going to be challenges for South Korea, I also think there's going to be opportunities. South Korea's response to COVID has been one of the most effective in the world. It's contained the virus more than most countries, especially more than most Western European countries, without sacrificing freedoms, as was done in other parts of the world. And I think South Korea's economy has been bouncing back. So I think it has a great opportunity to expand its own influence and soft power, especially during the next 4 or 5 years. I'll end there. Thank you very much again.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I'm not an expert on U.S.-China relations. I'm more an expert on, I'm not sure I'm an expert, but Japanese domestic political economy. But I'll try to share my perspective on U.S.-China relations under the Biden administration on one hand, as well as some of the implications of that for Japan on the other. So I think in terms of overall expectations, what I'm going to say probably has a lot in common with what the other speakers have already said. But I think that overall Biden's approach will be more systematic and principled, but that it will also be relatively moderate in its intent and ultimately even more moderate in its achievements, given the domestic political barriers that it will face. We need to understand that the US-China relationship is more complicated and arguably more important than any other bilateral relationship. And will include a complex combination of cooperation, competition, and confrontation under Biden, depending on the issue. And I think that compared to the Trump administration, we can expect US-China relations to become more logical, but not necessarily more straightforward, and certainly not necessarily warmer under Biden. Additionally, I think that Biden's narrow electoral win means that the 2024 Democratic presidential nominee, whether that's Biden himself or somebody else, will again have to take seriously the threat and pressure of Trumpian nativist rhetoric including with regards to China. And as some of the other presenters have said, I think appearing too soft on China is a major electoral risk for the Democrats that will certainly inform Biden's strategy regarding China. And I think we're already starting to see that. So turning to the issue of trade, I think that there are two major questions relating to trade that will impact US-China relations and political economic conditions in the wider East Asian region more generally. And the first is to look at how will US-China bilateral relations specifically be shaped by Biden's presidency. The second question that we need to consider is how will US trading relations with other Asian countries change under Biden, and what will the consequences of that be for China? And in terms of this first question, I think that Biden is likely to step away from sort of overly combative attitude toward China on issues that are not really China's fault. So certainly blaming China for the loss of US manufacturing jobs, as we saw over and over again under Trump. In some cases, perhaps removing more punitive tariffs that are not really deemed to have much economic merit. I think we'll see sort of a shift away from that approach, as well as a focus more on trying to improve the competitiveness of American manufacturing in sectors where they're falling behind China. And then regarding the question of trading relations between the US and other Asian countries, I think the biggest issue here is whether the US under Biden will end up joining the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, or the CPTPP. I think that given Biden and certainly Obama's past support for the agreement, there are reasons to think that Biden will at least try to join the agreement, but there are definitely going to be significant domestic political barriers to that happening. So it remains to be seen. So then what can we locate as some of the implications of this, of changes in American policies towards trading with China for Japan? Well, I think that Japan will be relieved to work with a US administration that is committed to a coherent approach to rational, evidence-based policymaking, and especially one that recognizes the importance of the US-Japan relationship. And I think that Japan will be even happier if Biden is able to get the US to join the TPP, which is seen as of vital strategic importance to countering China's rising economic and security threat. I think, under Abe, former Prime Minister Abe was a strong advocate of the US joining. So we'll see what happens under the new Prime Minister Suga. But I think that at the same time, Japan is currently the largest economy and most influential member of the CPTPP. So it's unrealistic to think that having, a country the size of the US join that agreement would come without any cost to Japan. So that's a sort of interesting issue there. Then turning to the question of technology, which I think many of the other speakers have located as a really key issue regarding US-China relations. I think that Biden would take a more nuanced approach to the economic and security implications of China's high-tech sector than what we saw under Trump. This will involve more emphasis on competition over confrontation with China through efforts to develop the American tech sector. But at the same time, it's really important to note that key issues of national security importance, and I think the biggest one here is probably 5G technology, will absolutely continue to be dealt with as major security concerns. So I think that, again, the underlying logic to technology issues with China will be a calculated, rational combination of cooperation, competition, and certainly in some cases, confrontation as well. So I do think we will probably see attempts to cooperate with China to establish more rigorous and transparent guidelines regarding issues of privacy, IPR, and patents, regardless of whether such efforts ultimately bear fruit. But, at least there's likely to be more attempts at dialogue and cooperation. But at the same time, I think we'll see efforts to, as I mentioned, improve American competitiveness in areas where the US is seen to be losing a competitive edge, And in areas where the US deems China to be threatening American security, Biden will take a more confrontational approach, including through sanctions and other measures. And I think key here is that this will be with the support and participation of allies. Multilateralism is going to anchor Biden's overall foreign policy to a much greater extent than what we saw under Trump, I think, needless to say. So what are the implications of these changes in the area of technology for Japan? Well, I think that, again, Japan is likely to benefit from the Biden administration's approach to technology, given Japan's close relationship with the US and Biden's shift back to a more multilateral approach to China and the Northeast Asian region. If the US can bring China to the table to negotiate more rigorous and transparent rules, certainly that will have wider regional benefits. And I also think that efforts to boost competitiveness with China in key high-tech sectors will not be a unilateral American effort, but will sort of be conceived of more in the sense of partnership between the US and its major Asia-Pacific allies, particularly Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. And so that's sort of where I see things going with regard to technology. The other key issue I want to talk about is diplomacy. And I think that while there will be important changes in areas of technology and trade, as well as certainly security, we can expect that diplomacy and issues of international cooperation will be where the most significant changes to the US approach occur. We can expect this on a range of issues, but most importantly, I think, climate change, health in the pandemic, and human rights. So on the first two issues, I think we can expect a renewed commitment to multilateralism and cooperation. This is a starting point of having an administration that fully accepts the scientific consensus surrounding climate change is an enormous change, but also having the US, rejoin and fully commit to the Paris Agreement is another one, as well as the WHO. So, having already rejoined the Paris Agreement, Biden will try to reassert US leadership globally on the climate issue, as well as with regard to COVID. I think that China, we have to remember, is not only the world's largest emitter of greenhouse gases, it's also one of the most dynamic major economies in combating climate change. So there's no question that cooperation on this issue will be very important, as with COVID, in terms of, ramping up vaccine production, and especially enabling a distribution of vaccines to developing countries, which is going to be, I think, a key issue, particularly next year. So cooperation will be key in those areas. And conversely, I think that we can, as some of the other presenters have mentioned, we can expect human rights to be one area where Biden will likely push China harder than Trump did. And we're certainly, I think, already seeing this in some ways. Hong Kong, as well as the treatment of ethnic Uyghurs in Xinjiang province, are the leading issues there. These issues are sort of maybe temporarily on the back burner, but that never really go away. So what are the implications of this for Japan? I think that aside from being able to rely on the cooperation and support of a close and very powerful ally, diplomatic issues, that Japan will benefit from the shift away from the Trump era's man-to-man style of deal-making. In other words, we'll see a shift away from US-China relations and negotiations driven by the narrow concerns of one country or even of just one man, and towards an approach that is generally concerned about balancing American national interests, narrowly defined, with regional and even global interests. To some degree, we might have expected this to occur 30 or 40 years ago when American power was so much greater than it is today. But I think that Japan will also welcome the ability to defer to the US on issues such as human rights, where given its wartime history, it lacks the normative legitimacy to unilaterally criticize China. So this question of the influence of American sort of multilateral assertiveness, I think, extends to other issues such as climate change and trade liberalization as well. Japan actually has a long history of being deliberately passive and reactive on issues of both foreign and domestic policy that might be unpopular or controversial at home. Historically have involved issues such as defense spending and trade liberalization. Today, I think we might want to add climate change policy commitments to this. The Japanese state often waits for American pressure before acting and uses that American pressure as a political excuse domestically. So it'll be interesting to see how that dynamic may or may not play out on these key issues of international cooperation. So I think those are the key implications from the perspective of diplomacy. So overall, I think that there are four main takeaways from all this. One, I think we should expect a more consistent, nuanced, rational, evidence and theory-driven approach to China from the US that includes a mix of cooperation, competition, and confrontation in some cases. But do not expect the US to abandon its tough stance on China in areas that it deems important, such as technology, human rights, and regional security. Number two, expect multilateralism, relations with strategic allies, and consideration of wider geopolitical dynamics to inform US foreign policy, including regarding China. But do not expect the US to give European and Asian allies a free pass or a free ride on security commitments. Number three, expect progress in some areas such as climate, COVID, and trade, but do not expect too much change, or certainly for Biden to be able to fully implement his foreign policy agenda, given the significant domestic political hurdles and electoral considerations. And the fourth point that we really need to consider, I think Professor Lee mentioned this, is that the world of today is structurally different from 5 or 10 years ago. And when Obama was first elected, Chinese GDP was only 35%, right? Roughly 1/3 of US GDP. Today it's 75%, 3/4. That's a categorical change. The gap is only going to close. Likely China will pass the US certainly by the end of this decade. And so China is stronger and more threatening, and increasingly so, while the US is at least relatively weaker, both economically and politically. And Biden must operate in this context, no matter how much he might want to go back to 2009 and the Obama era. It's a completely different world today. All right, so that is my presentation. Thank you for listening, and look forward to any questions.